वसुदेवसुतं देवं कंसचाणूरमर्दनं देवकी परमानन्दं कृष्णो वन्दे जगद्गुरुम्. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Welcome to our ongoing class on Bhagavad Gita in the light of Sri Ramakrishna. Thank you for coming on an odd day, namely Monday instead of Sunday morning. We're here Monday, 7:30 p.m. PST, and thank you all online for also joining us today. Today, we'll be discussing verses 4.19 to 23 probably, and I'll just summarize maybe a few more verses, and chapter 19 of Sri Aurobindo's Essays on the Gita, which is called Equality. It's a remarkable chapter in many ways. Pages 188 to 199 of Essays on the Gita. A heads up for the next class. The next class is on Monday, again a Monday, notice. Monday, January 27th at 7:30 p.m. PST. And here's the assignment. Read Bhagavad Gita verses 4.36 to 42. So the last few verses of chapter 4. And chapter 5, verses 1 through 19. And chapter 20 of Essays on the Gita, the next chapter of Essays on the Gita. This next chapter is called Equality and Knowledge, pages 200 to 211. And then please answer the study questions by Sunday, not Saturday, because we're pushing everything back one day. Submit your study question responses by Sunday, January 26th at 7 p.m. PST. Okay, so here's my proposal. We'll start by discussing some of the verses in chapter 4, and then we'll get into discussing chapter 19 of Sri Aurobindo's Essays on the Gita, his take on equality. We'll discuss your study question responses and try to address the questions that you have. All right, so that's the plan. Can you please open your app? And let's look at 4.20, chapter 4, verse 20. And please repeat after me. I know I did verse 20 a while ago. Actually, you know what? We don't need to repeat it. I want to emphasize. We'll start really with 21, but Tyaktva. Okay, you repeat after me. What's the problem? Okay. Tyaktva karma phala sangam nityatripto nirashrayah karmanyavi pravrittopi naiva kinchit karoti saha. Okay. Again, the context here is really important. Remember the very first verse of chapter 4. Krishna announces to Arjuna that he taught this ancient yoga to all these great sages in the past. And Arjuna gets confused because how could you have taught these sages in the past if you're talking to me now? And then he explains he's God and he's incarnated many times in the past. But that yoga, what was that yoga, that ancient yoga that he passed down long back? It's a kind of integral yoga that is grounded in bhakti, devotion toward the Purushottama, and which issues in selfless action, karma yoga. So bhakti yoga, karma yoga, jnana yoga, they're all fused together in this yoga. That's the context of chapter 4. Okay, and now verse 20 of chapter 4 is going in the same line, because in the second line it says, karmani abhi pravrittopi. Even though this person is constantly engaged in karma, in actions, naiva kinchit karoti saha, still he doesn't act. What in the world could that mean? If you're acting constantly, what does it mean that you don't act? It means he's identified with his spiritual nature, understood either as the impersonal Atman, the non-dual self, which is strictly inactive and static and transcendental, but it could also mean the Purushottama. The Purushottama is dynamic, but as the Amsha, as a soul, he still takes a step back from the body-mind complex. It's the body and the mind that are acting. And he is a spiritual entity separate from the body-mind complex in that sense. Okay? So this is the context. It's kind of describing the ideal karma yogi who engages in action but tyaktva karma phalasangam. That's the first phrase, which means having renounced all attachment to the fruits of his or her actions. Okay? That's the context. So now let's look at the next verse, which is quite interesting. Please repeat after me, 4.21. Nirashihi yatachittatma tyakta sarva parigraha shariram kevalam karma kurvannapnoti kilbisham. Okay, good. So the anvaya here, the rearrangement of the words, nirashihi, completely free from any kinds of expectations, hopes, I want this, I need this to happen, none of that, which is very common among us struggling karma yogis and spiritual aspirants, but this ideal karma yogi is completely free of that. Tyakta sarva parigraha. So, nirashi, free from expectations and hopes. The next phrase, tyakta sarva parigraha, has been interpreted in different ways by different commentators, as we'll see in a second. But Sri Aurobindo interprets it as, does not seize on things as his personal possessions. So devoid of me and mine. Okay? Yata chitta atma. This is a person who has a restrained, harmonized mind and soul. Sri Aurobindo says his heart and self are under perfect control. Kevalam shariram karma. This is the most interesting phrase in the verse. Kevalam shariram karma. Now, how to translate it is tricky because there are different interpretations. Sri Aurobindo interprets this to mean performing action by the body alone. Okay, and we'll see in a second what he means by that. And then Sri Aurobindo says, Kurvan, or not Sri Aurobindo says, Krishna says, Kurvan kilvisham na apnoti. Engaging in action in this way, he does not incur any sin. Okay? Now, why is this phrase so interesting? This shariram kevalam karma. Well, shariram means literally something like of or pertaining to the body, the physical body. Shariram. Sharira means body. Shariram means of or pertaining to the body. Kevalam. Kevalam means exclusively or only. Karma. So the karma, the actions of this ideal karma yogi are what? Shariram kevalam. Now, the most literal translation would be they are only bodily or something like that. They only pertain to the body. Sri Aurobindo renders it in that way, performing action by the body alone. It's right. Action is strictly bodily, let's say. And Sri Aurobindo, let's see how he interprets it. He explains it as follows. He says, the action of the liberated man is indeed a purely physical action. Shariram kevalam karma. For all else comes from above, is not generated on the human plane, is only a reflection of the will, knowledge, joy of the divine Purushottama. Okay, so Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of this is he's acting only with the body because he's identified with the Purushottama and he's a pure instrument of the Purushottama. And the Purushottama is acting through him. Now, interestingly, Shankara has a radically different interpretation of this phrase, Shariram Kevalam Karma, but more broadly of many of these verses. Why? As usual, because of his distinction between two levels of spiritual aspirant. Inferior spiritual aspirants are eligible only for Karma Yoga and Bhakti Yoga. And superior spiritual aspirants are eligible for Jnana Yoga, and those superior spiritual aspirants should no longer be practicing Karma Yoga and Bhakti Yoga, correct? That's always a scheme to keep in mind with Shankara. So now, he's always kind of like, when he's interpreting scriptures like the Gita, even the Upanishads, every verse, like if a verse talks about Karma Yoga, he's like, that's for inferior spiritual aspirants. If it talks about Jnana Yoga, that's for superior spiritual. So these verses are a little tricky because some of them he's kind of like trying to push in the direction of Jnana Yoga, all renouncing sannyasis who are renouncing all actions. And then other ones, it's like so overtly Karma Yoga oriented that he can't deny it. And so then he says, well, they're for inferior spiritualities. But at best, what he's doing is jumping back and forth between these two standpoints. And he does the same kind of thing in the Isha Upanishad, where he says, like, verse 1 is for superior spiritualities, verse 2 for inferior. And then you have to ask, well, aren't you reading your own ideas into the text? I mean, shouldn't there be a kind of consistency or a consistent thread, exactly, a flow? So in the same way, what I've been arguing, based on starting with verse 20, but actually going back to verse 1 of chapter 4, is that consistently the whole chapter is about the ideal karma yogi, right? And Krishna himself as the ideal karma yogi and how we should try to emulate him. And by engaging in action as karma yoga, we not only don't incur sin, we attain the highest spiritual perfection. That's the whole point of the chapter, at least on a certain prima facie reading, and that's definitely Sri Aurobindo's understanding. Shankara, however, interprets, for instance, this verse 21 as referring to a superior spiritual aspirant, a sannyasi, who has renounced all actions and is devoted to Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge alone. So now, how does he interpret? First, let's look at the last phrase of the first line. Tyakta sarva parigraha. Notice Sri Aurobindo, he doesn't say who has renounced all possessions, right? Because then that would come closer to the Shankarite sannyasi. Sri Aurobindo's reading does not seize on things as his personal possessions, right? I drive a car, but I don't say it's my car and I don't become attached to it. So it's an internal state that Sri Aurobindo is talking about. You're free from that attachment, that me and mine, that sense of me and mine toward whatever you own, okay? Shankara, however, interprets this phrase, Tyakta sarva parigara, to mean that monk, that all-renouncing monk who has renounced all possessions. Okay? So, that's already signaling that this is a superior spiritual aspirant, an all-renouncing monk. But then, the next phrase is really interesting. Sharidam kevalam karma. How does Shankara interpret it? He interprets it to mean the only actions that this all-renouncing sannyasin engages in are those meant to maintain the body, the physical body. Which means what? Begging for food. And
all the eating, all bodily actions.
And eating in the bodily actions, and then whatever bodily actions are necessary to go to the Guru and listen to the Tattvam Asi Mahavakya, and even sit in your asana, right? So that kind of stuff. I mean, he's not completely stationary all the time, so whatever minimal movement, physical movement is necessary for Jnana Yoga, for the path of knowledge and to keep the body alive, only so much action does he engage in. So Shankara has a completely different understanding of Shariram Kevalam Karma. It's kind of interesting. Okay. Now, let's look at verse 22. Please repeat after me. This is, by the way, this first phrase is famous for devotees in our tradition because Naran almost kind of lectures Sri Ramakrishna. I'll bring it up. I'll first explain the verse, then I'll remind you of the gospel incident. Yadricchalava santushto dvandvatito vimatsaraha samaha siddhau asiddhau cha kritvapi nanibadhyate. Okay, this first phrase, Yadricha Lava Santushto. Naran, the future Swami Vivekananda, whose birthday is coming up. Actually, his Western birthday was yesterday, and we are celebrating his birthday on the 19th. Sri Ramakrishna is talking about food and the kind of food he can eat and the kind of food he has difficulty eating. And he says that, I can eat these foods, I can't eat those foods in the gospel. And then Naran gives him a little lecture and says, but what about Yadricha Lava Santushto? Why don't you just eat whatever is given to you? Why don't you be satisfied, actually? Santushto means satisfied with Yadricha Lava. Whatever is given to you, like a good monk, begging from door to door. You can't be high maintenance and say, oh, I don't want that. Oh, come on. So Naren does that because you know how Naren is. He's okay. Dvandvatita, beyond the dualities, all dualities. What are those dualities? Heat and cold, happiness and pain, you name it. All those. Free from all those. He's not affected by any of them. Why? Because he is equal, right? Equality. Equal sounds weird in English, right? Equanimous, but equal. Sri Aurobindo likes the word equality. So this is a phrase that clearly conveys the kind of equality that Sri Aurobindo is talking about in the chapter that we're discussing for today. And then vimatsaraha, jealous of nobody. Swami Vivekananda used to say that jealousy is the bane of India, and it's a symptom of the slave mentality. Because of course it was during the British colonial rule, and I lived in India for 13 years, and I still find that there's still traces of this jealousy. It's not quite going away, unfortunately. But anyway, this ideal karma yogi, free from jealousy, thankfully. Okay, and siddho asiddho cha samaha. Siddho means in success, or toward success, you can say, and then asiddho in failure, toward failure, cha samaha. Samaha means equal. Exactly the same in both success and failure. You don't react, you don't freak out or get really upset or devastated if you fail. You don't become elated and, jump around, you're on cloud nine when you succeed. Kind of even keel. Cool, And I think this is a good test. One of the study questions is about kind of equality as a test and how we can measure our own spiritual progress. In my own case, when I was a grad student at Berkeley, and I was just starting to try to publish things, and I would try, in a way, to not to care about whether the thing is accepted or not. Like I would submit an article to a journal. I would tell myself I shouldn't care, but then I would really get upset if it was rejected, and I was like super ecstatic when it was accepted, especially the first one, because that's like the big first publication. But now I've published a lot, and I've joined the order and whatever. And looking like just testing now when the same thing happens, if a paper gets rejected by a journal, I don't care. When it gets accepted, okay, fine, that's also God's will. Like I'm not saying I'm perfect, but I'm more moving in that direction now. So I think that's a positive sign. And I'll share some of your own thoughts on this and experiences. I really loved your study question responses this time. And because it involves some personal stuff, I may omit names to spare people embarrassment, if there is any. Okay. So, sama siddha vasiddhocha, equal in success and failure. Obviously, this is also equality, right? And kritva api nanibadhyate. This last phrase is really important. I think poses a serious problem for Shankara and his followers. Kritva api means while engaged in action, even though engaged fully in actions, not nibadhyate. Those actions don't bind this person. This should remind us, if anyone is familiar with the second mantra of the Isha Upanishad, exactly the same thing. Kurvanneveha karmani jijivishet shatagga samaha. What happened? Hold on. Kurvanneveha karmani jijivishet shatagga samaha. Oh my goodness. Okay, I'm blanking. Sorry. Can anyone prompt me on this? No. It's embarrassing. This is one of them. Anyway, all right. Hopefully I'll remember it later. Anyway, but the point is, nakarma lipite nare is the last part of that, of the second mantra of Isha Upanishad. And the Gita is kind of influenced by the Isha Upanishad in a pretty direct way, I think, because this Isha Upanishad is the first, and I think one of the only Upanishads, to really strongly emphasize karma yoga as a spiritual practice, especially the second mantra. And nakarma lipite nare means if you engage in actions as karma yoga, nakarma lipite nare means that action doesn't stick to you. You don't generate any good or bad karma. It's just meant for for purifying the mind and then attaining liberation. Okay. Okay, so this last phrase, I think, why do I think it poses a problem for Shankara? Because clearly it says, Kritva api nani baddhate. this person is fully engaged in actions, and there's no suggestion here that the actions are only begging for food, and seems to be all actions. And there are other phrases which are very explicit about all, like this person is, I like this phrase of Sri Aurobindo, a many-sided universal worker. It's not that he engages in some actions which are sort of inherently spiritual and avoids the actions which are worldly or secular. It's not that. All actions, from raising your children to going to work to this or that, everything is spiritualized, right? Without exception. Okay, now let's look at. So, I don't know if you guys remember, but weeks ago, possibly months ago, in the context of sacrifice, remember an early chapter in Essays on the Gita, we discussed the next few verses on sacrifice. Yajna, the term is yajna in Sanskrit. So 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, and 35. Yeah, so basically 23 up to 35 we've already discussed in the context of sacrifice. I'm going to extremely briefly summarize it for the purposes of our discussion today. Okay, 23. Yajnaya acharatah karma. All actions that this ideal karma yogi engages in are a sacrifice to him. They're a form of sacrifice. Sacrifice of the lower self for the sake of the divine. That's the basic idea, what we talked about in that class. So the Gita is providing a kind of symbolic interpretation of yajna. Yajna typically meant ritualistic sacrifices, which are prescribed in the ritualistic portion of the Vedas, right? And it's all very material, and you want material things, you want to go to heaven, enjoy life, and then come back, and this and that. The Gita gives a very symbolic, spiritual kind of interpretation of sacrifice, and literally everything can be a sacrifice. And then in the next few verses, it goes on to explain what some of these different forms of sacrifice are. Doing pranayama is a form of sacrifice. Self-control is a form of sacrifice. Any kind of ascesis, austerity, is a form of sacrifice, right? Anything that involves sacrifice of ego or lower self is a sacrifice. And 24, verse 24, famous verse which we all chant before we eat, Brahmarpanam Brahmahavid. This is the standpoint of the Vijnani who sees the Purushottama, the divine, in everything and in everyone. And that's significant because this is crucial to how Sri Aurobindo understands the Gita's understanding of spiritual equality. Seeing the divine not only in oneself but in all beings. And then serving them accordingly. We'll get to that in a second when we get to equality. Shiva Jnani Jiva Seva. Okay. And then I wanted to remind you, let's jump to 35. As I said, we already talked about it in detail earlier in an earlier class, but I want to remind you of this, draw your attention to this. So the last phrase in verse 35 of chapter 4 is Drakshyasi Atmani Ataha Mai. If you engage in all actions as sacrifice, what happens? Drakshyasi, you will see. You will see all existences, all bhutani, first Atmani, in the self, the Atman, in the Atman. Ataha, then, Ataha means then, Mai, Krishna says, then in me. And I don't know if you remember, Atmani Atomai, Sri Aurobindo has a field day with this and says this beautifully corresponds to the spiritual stages of?
Jnana and Vijnana.
Very good. Jnana and Vijnana. What Sri Ramakrishna calls Jnana and Vijnana, what the Gita also calls Jnana and Vijnana in chapter 7 and chapter 3. Jnana will correspond to seeing all beings in the impersonal self with a capital S. Realization of the non-dual impersonal self. But that's not the highest or the last realization. It's not the final realization. Ataha, after that comes the even greater spiritual realization of all beings in the divine Purushottama, Krishna in the sense of the Purushottama, which is impersonal, personal. And you see the divine everywhere. That's the Brahmarpanam verse again. Okay? So here you get this very clear sequence. Like, this should remind us also of, I mentioned, even though we haven't gotten to chapter 7, do you remember in the context of discussing Vijnana, I mentioned 7.3. Manushanam sahasreshu kaschid yatati siddhaye yatatamapi siddhanam kaschin mam veti tatvatah. Which means, so among hundreds of thousands of people, only a few strive after perfection. And then the next line is really tricky. Yatatam api siddhanam, even among those strivers who have attained perfection. Siddhanam, siddha means somebody who's attained perfection. Kaschin mam veti tatvataha, only a few of those people who have attained perfection attain me, says Krishna. Again, suggesting a kind of two different categories. Those who attain spiritual perfection, and so Sri Aurobindo says, that's like jnana. You've realized the self, you've attained liberation, good for you. But there's a tiny minority of people, even among those self-realized people, who go on to attain the even rarer and greater spiritual realization of the divine Purushottama. Okay? Kaschin mam veti tattva. Only a few know me, the Purushottama. Okay, so that's enough in terms of Gita verses. So now let's look at and discuss the equality, chapter 19 of Sri Aurobindo's essays on the Gita. Okay. So, the first study question was, according to Sri Aurobindo, what is distinctive about the Gita's conception of equality? And how does it differ from three different kinds of equality? Stoic equality, philosophic equality, and Christian equality. Anthony was saying it seems like he might be strawmanning or picking on Christianity a little bit. We'll talk about that. Okay, so you guys gave very thoughtful answers, and I wanted to read out to you a few of them. So Karthik from India, I like this because I always like it when people bring in Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. That's part of the point of this course, Bhagavad Gita in the light of Sri Ramakrishna. Karthik says, Gita's conception of equality is distinctive because it is based on the spiritual self. That's here, based on the self beyond the three gunas. It leads to same-sidedness or samadrishti, because of which one can see the divine in oneself and in the world outside. So that's, he's referring to two here. Sees the divine not only in oneself but in all beings. Then he says, this leads to an attitude of service of humans and other beings as God. As Sri Ramakrishna says, Shiva Jnane Jivid Seva. Serving others in a spirit of worship by seeing the divine in all beings. And then he says, to me, Stoic equality is founded on a physical mastery of nature, while Christian equality is based on emotional mastery, gained through resignation to a higher power, and philosophic equality is intellectual. Gita accepts all of these as steps which lead to spiritual equality. It differs from all three as it transcends nature, physical, emotional, and intellectual. So I thought that's a pretty good summary. And I really like the connection with Sri Ramakrishna's Shiva Jnana Jiva Seva, because I think it really does. I think Sri Aurobindo really has Sri Ramakrishna's teaching in mind. He doesn't say so explicitly, but this is one of those many places where I think implicitly he really has this concept in mind. Okay. Other people. Kelly says, the Gita's conception of equality is a synthesis of the other three levels or stepping stones of equality, Stoic, philosophic, and Christian. I don't have that written here, but that is an important part of the Gita's concept of spiritual equality, is that it's synthesized. It's not that it's like totally different from these three, Stoic, philosophic, and Christian. It combines all of them, synthesizes them, and goes beyond them. Okay. Then she says, but importantly, the Gita's formulation does not stop at a mere weaving of these methods alone. Rather, it raises the strengths of these three to the higher spiritual level by bringing the power of the spiritual being to fore. Recognition of the self, capital S, which transcends the effects of the three gunas on the human character. And then she puts in parentheses, Stoic equality foundation. The mind, philosophic equality foundation. And the emotions, Christian equality foundation. So that's, Sri Aurobindo makes a lot of correspondences with these three, and I think she's right, and so is Karthik in linking the mind or intellect with philosophical equality, emotions or feeling with Christian equality, and there's a place where Sri Aurobindo refers to character, actually, that Stoic equality is based on just strength of character. You attain self-mastery just through character, but there are also some references, I think, also to the body. Karthik is thinking of somehow the physical body as well being involved. This reminds me actually of, I was thinking this Stoic equality versus Christian equality. There's an incident in the life of Sri Ramakrishna and in the life of Swami Vivekananda that I think kind of parallels this. When they had trouble with lust, both of them did at one point. Sri Ramakrishna, this is recorded in Sharanandaji's biography, The Great Master, Lila Prashango, where he one day feels that he's completely conquered lust, and then suddenly he feels an uncontrollable wave of lust that comes over him, Sri Ramakrishna. And what does he do? Does anyone remember and where this might fall? What does he do? Come on, guys. Sharanandaji's biography. I know Alice has read at least. Don't tell me you skipped that section. It's a good one. Okay. All right.
He's about to
Please. Yes, what?
kill himself or something.
Well, sort of. So he...
He like throw himself on the ground.
Yes, and weeping, throws himself on, Mother, oh mother, if it comes to this, I'm going to cut my throat. But something like the Christian equality, I think. Prayer, resignation, submission to... I mean, I don't know if submission to the will of God exactly, but it's similar at least. This just falling at the feet of Mother and crying to her. Okay. Not in the teenage Swamiji. How does he one time feels lust. What does he do? And where does that fall? Does anyone know? This is in Nikolaji's biography. Yeah, what? How does he react to the lust?
Just feels like
Yeah, he literally, I mean, it's very much a Rajasic kind of stoic equality. He sits on a heap of burning coals and scars himself.
But Thakur's also doesn't seem really like in resignation and
Yeah,
submission.
no, I know. That's why I mean,
He is rejecting it. So
he's rejecting what?
the wave of lust, as you said, that he's not really saying if you will, so then so be it.
No. That's not what. I mean,
resigning
that's not
himself
what
from-
resignation to God means. Like, oh, you want me to have lust? Okay, let me have lust.
No,
No.
I think
Not in
it's
that
more-
sense.
It's also Rajasic, I think.
You think that's also well, in a way, yeah, that's interesting.
He said, "I'll kill myself.
I think
If you do this, I'll kill myself."
Mm.
I think what's interesting is his advice to Surendra.
Mm.
So Surendra was a drunkard, right? And he had problems in the
Shurendra.
Yeah.
I thought Kalipada Ghosh and Girish Chandra Ghosh.
No, also
Shurendra, huh? Yeah, maybe. Okay, yeah,
Actually,
okay.
in the Bengali gospel, I
Yeah.
think there is this description where he has problems with alcohol.
Okay.
And Thakur does not tell him to completely give up alcohol,
Right.
but he says
Offered to mother.
he offered.
Yeah, correct. He said it to Girish too, I think. Yeah, exactly. Right.
Yeah.
So that is interesting because that's not actually any of them, right? In some sense, or maybe number 3.
Number 3.
Yeah.
Okay, let me go on because we have got a lot to discuss here. Don Salmon, which is a great name, Don. Nice name. Salmon. I mean, like the fish. Okay. Don says, this is an interesting nuance here. He's talking about Stoicism. He says, the philosophic attitude is inspired by someone who ironically was one of the great Stoics, Marcus Aurelius, who is perhaps also the subtlest and most psychological of the Stoics. Understanding that, as Aurelius famously observed, quote, it is not the external response of others that is responsible for my emotional reaction, but my own attitude and beliefs, end quote. I can turn my attention away from external responses and through intellectual analysis, calmly examine my own attitudes and beliefs in the effort to come to a more equanimous response. So I think this is a very nice and subtle and learned correction to or objection to Sri Aurobindo's. The argument would be that Sri Aurobindo is to a certain extent strawmanning Stoicism by contrasting it with philosophical quality. Because Don is suggesting that in some of the key Stoic figures, you do find a more sattvic kind of intellectual discernment involved in the Stoic practice as well.
Most of them, actually. It's a lot of
Yeah,
detachment.
it does seem like, and also like emphasizing the ephemerality of life,
Well, I think-
all the things that he talks about under philosophical quality.
I think one of the things about the Stoics was they were like, especially Marcus Aurelius,
Mhm.
right? I mean, they were very Rajasic and Karma yogic in that sense.
In-
Whereas he's thinking
okay.
maybe of philosophers who
Hmm.
were
More
like,
quietistic or
yeah,
something.
the quietistic ones.
One thing to say about Sri Aurobindo, he was a brilliant classics student, and he studied classics at Cambridge. He knew Latin and Greek thoroughly, and I'm sure he studied the Stoics in the original Latin. And so it's not that he wasn't aware of it. So maybe there's some deeper understanding of Stoicism,
I
which
think also he may not be, like, Stoic does not always mean the
No,
Stoic philosophy.
but it is capital S, and that's why I was wondering whether because of the capital S. But maybe he means it in a broader sense. Because Stoic just means this austere endurance kind of a thing, like be stoic and suck it up. That's true. So that's a good point. Maybe even if, though it's a capital S, he's not necessarily just referring to the narrow stoicism of Marcus Aurelius, etc. But yeah, it's possible. Let me read Ellis's, because I thought that's a nice one too. Ellis says, Sri Aurobindo says that the stoic equality is centered on self-mastery through endurance. It finds its pinnacle when one can endure the shocks of life with equanimity. It does not, however, free the aspirant from the rasa of sense pleasures. It runs the risk of leaving one isolated and insensitive, he says. He relates this to a rajasic equality. So I think all of that's accurate. Then Ellis continues. He says the philosophic equality is founded on an intellectual self-mastery by knowledge and detachment. This equality understands the transitory nature of life and so causes one to be detached from sense objects. Sri Aurobindo sees this as a more sattvic equality. However, it doesn't actually free one from the lower nature. He calls the Christian equality surrender to the will of God, which he implies is beset by the stress of the emotions. And then you add, interestingly, with the question mark, sattvo tamasic, because Sri Aurobindo doesn't actually make it correspond to the gunas.
Right.
And so it does leave us wondering, well, which of the gunas? I mean, he's covered rajas and sattva, so is it somehow tamasic in some way? And I see where you're going, maybe. Are you thinking maybe of like Sri Ramakrishna's baby kitten, which is like, I'm just going to sit still and let mother cat take me wherever she feels like. So there's a sort of sattvic form of tamas involved in just lying still. Or like his example of the bird on a mast. The bird flies in one direction and then flies all the way back and then gets tired. And then goes in the other direction. But then finally, what's the ultimate spiritual, the highest state? I'm just sitting on the mast. And it's kind of, well, isn't that lazy? No, it's a spiritual laziness. Not laziness, but it's total surrender, yeah.
Sri Aurobindo uses the term pious resignation.
Yeah.
And that's not the bird sitting on the mast.
Pious resignation.
Yeah, literally, I mean, I can quote it.
Right, but no, why is that not the bird on the mast?
It's resignation.
Right, but
You're resigning yourself to whatever happens, and you're being.
So why is the bird on the mast not that, or in what sense is that different?
The bird on the mast is let go of everything.
Correct.
Someone who's forcing themselves to be passive is tamasic, in my opinion. I'm trying to interpret his phrasing, but that's
no. This is Ellis's interesting interpretation because he doesn't give a guna for for Christian equality.
I think it is tamasic.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. I mean, I think it's worth thinking about. I'm not really sure where in terms of the gunas Christian equality will fall. Okay, then Ellis says, the Gita accepts and synthesizes all of these ideas, but takes them a level up by applying to them the transcendent nature of the spirit, which is beyond the aforementioned pitfalls. And then he says, in the Gita's equality, one rises above the qualities of the gunas, above the intellect, and is centered in the self. This equality does not make one aloof from others, but causes one to see the divine in all beings, making one full of compassion and the idea of universal unity. This equality does not steer one away from action, yet causes one to act from a place of oneness, which does not disturb their equality. So I think that's a nice way of putting it. Okay, there are a lot more of these, but you guys all did a good job, I think, here. I like Sultan. Sultan is that Berkeley PhD student that comes here once in a while when he's visiting his parents. So Sultan says, the Gita's conception of equality is its foundation in the spirit, soul, and its universalities. So that's this. It differs from the other three types of equality by integrating all three as means to gain awareness of the essential equality and bliss of the spirit. In other words, the Gita's conception of equality places it as a foundational tenet. It is the essence of the spirit. And then he says, I like this last sentence, contrarily, for the other three conceptions, equality is a consequence of discipline, I think he's thinking of Stoic equality, reasoning, philosophical equality, or devotion. This is Christian equality. So I thought that's a nice way of putting it. Now, study question number 2. On page 189 of Essays on the Gita, Sri Aurobindo writes, equality is the sign and also for the aspirant the test. What does he mean by this? Please give 1 or 2 examples from your own spiritual life explaining how your equality has been tested. And I'm going to be I said I'd omit names, so I'm going to omit names, but some of you know who you are. You're in the room. Okay. This is really nice. He means that an aspirant can measure their spiritual progress to some extent by the manifestation of equality in their life. He says that a karma yogi knows that he is free in the midst of action by his equality. So when one notices a lack of equality, that means that there is some, quote, motion of desire, play of personal will, etc. My equality is tested every day. There's so much pull in the world for one to run after sense objects and sense pleasures in an unequal way. Thankfully, I'm glad to say that I've noticed that as I've dedicated more time to sadhana and mindfulness, these pulls are mitigated greatly, and my equality often wins the day, as it were. But the tests are constant with every bad driver, every advertisement, every memory that seems to want to pull me back to a less spiritual place. And then, interestingly, he brings up an example of, I don't want people to start guessing who it might be. He's not in the room. Okay, I don't know. Anyway, one very specific and subtle confusing test of my equality comes when there's a discussion of veganism. It's hard for me to be even-minded when this topic arises, especially since I think the vegan philosophy as a whole is a net benefit to the world, both physically and spiritually, reinforcing the ideas of oneness and ahimsa, non-injury. I know I'm attached to this, and this attachment causes some disturbance. According to Sri Aurobindo, I should be able to do the work of advocating for the reduction of suffering, but at the same time be transcendent of the feelings that arise from the disheartening actions I see from people who don't see things the way that I do. This I have not been able to reconcile. I thought that was interesting. Drew, oops, I should not be mentioning names, but anyway, okay. Okay, Drew, you don't mind. All right. He says, spiritual aspirants established in the knowledge of the divine will demonstrate perfect equality based on the transcendental unity of all things. As spiritual aspirants, we strive to demonstrate our love of the divine by being equanimous towards all because of their inherent divinity. However, this is much easier said than done because stabilizing transcendental equality requires constant effort until one is firmly established in the consciousness of the divine. One specific example I can remember is at the wake of a family member. My aunt, who I did not particularly like, attended after shunning the family for years. I remember telling myself repeatedly that she was God too, so I would not react to any slights perceived or intended. However, she commented something about the deceased that rubbed me the wrong way because she was disparaging the person and his Catholic faith. I didn't say anything, but I remember judging her and thinking what a terrible person she was. However, later I reminded myself that even those who hate God have a relationship with the divine and will come to realize the truth. Who was I to judge her just because she had no interest in spirituality and made offhand comments? The incident reminds me of the Ram Dass quote. I love this. If you think you are enlightened, go and spend a week with your family. I love that. That deserves a clap. Love that. I got to quote that. I got to use that in a lecture. Okay, so thank you, Drew. Animesh says, one example I want to share. There was a time 12 years back when I lost my Microsoft. Why do I keep mentioning the names of these people? I'm sorry. This is bad. Okay. Anyway, most of you don't know each other because you're in different parts of the world. Anyway, all right. Okay. There was a time 12 years back when I lost my Microsoft job and my wife was diagnosed with cancer at the same time. Though my relatives and others were shocked, I honestly did not feel that strong anxiety in my mind at that time. Our son was just 6 years old. By God's grace, within 3 months, my wife recovered completely after surgery and I got another nice job offer. At that time, I felt I'd made some progress in my spiritual journey. As earlier in my college days, I would have felt anxiety over small things. Okay, another person, I'm getting better at this. Okay, now you know the gender. Anyway, test of equality. She says, I had failed miserably. She says, my grandparents had introduced Thakur and Ma to me at Joyrambati when I was a 4-year-old baby. I have not been able to process the grief surrounding the demise of my grandmother. Grief still has its stronghold on me, and I've been trying to fight the loneliness ever since. Thus, I have not been able to accept her absence with a high-browed, serene, philosophical indifference. This has made me realize that there are certain instances in life where moving on from grief is not an option. Or maybe I happen to be a very poor philosopher, unfit for immortality. I think you're beating up on yourself, and you're being a little too hard on yourself.
Yeah, we all miss our grandmas.
We all miss our grandmas, and it's a journey. We're all works in progress here. And I appreciate your honesty, so thank you. Karthik. Oops. Okay, I'm going to skip that one. I'm sorry. Okay. I'm just really bad at this. Okay. Let's see here. Max has a really interesting one. Oh man. Okay. You gotta be kidding me. Oh, okay, but this is nothing too bad, and nobody dies, I think. Okay, so my equanimity is constantly tested. The biggest arena is at work. I've got a lot of ego and self-worth wrapped up in what I do, and how good I do it is based on the passion I invest. I credit much of my success to my attempted implementation of the Gita's principles. That said, I see how far I still have to go on a daily basis. How often do I really do my absolute best? Not very often. Do I really think of what I do as an offering? No, I think of it as a chore. And when the results are good and everyone applauds, I feel great. Conversely, I suffer 1,000 deaths when I don't win at work or I don't get the results I want. The best I can do is walk away and try to leave work at work. It's a battle. Another area where my evenness of mind or equality was tested is when my wife and I used to go to meditation retreats. We would be all fired up afterwards, but as soon as real life intruded, we would crumble in our spiritual disciplines and even in our mood. So after in-person retreats sort of stopped with the pandemic, we don't have the highs, which I miss, but perhaps we're more steady in a way, being less reliant on the big charge or high of the in-person events. And then he adds kindly, these online classes help and have become part of our practice. Okay, so that was nice. Okay. Huh? No. So I'm gonna, there are more, but we need to get to the other questions, and then I have questions your questions that I want to get to. So, okay. Study question number 3. In chapter 19 of Essays on the Gita, Sri Aurobindo distinguishes tamasic, rajasic, and sattvic equality. Did your spiritual life begin with any of these 3 kinds of equality or some combination of them? Please give 1 or 2 specific examples if you're willing to share. Okay, Anonymous says, I think my spiritual life began with what Sri Aurobindo would call a rajasic equality. I was striving for self-mastery through personal development. I was intrigued by the idea of control of the mind and senses through meditation. I even had some success in this respect by conquering my fear of death through a combination of logical inquiry and meditation. But I would say that almost falls more into this, or at least partly under the philosophic. But I was only ever able to get so far in spiritual life this way. I was completely dependent on my own will and effort. So that is more like the austere endurance. And although that is needed, I now see that it's not the whole story. But then the same person adds, really interestingly, and there's a connection with another respondent online. To be honest, after some unaided reading of a little of Sri Shankara, I felt as though I dipped into sattvo-tamasic territory for a while, seeing the world as illusory, and therefore, in my mind, ultimately pointless from a practical standpoint. Thankfully, with further study and hearing Vijnana Vedanta, Integral Advaita, and Tantric ideas, that is no longer the case. So that's really interesting, and even more interesting because, let me share with you another anonymous person's response to this question. This person says, yes, my spiritual life began mainly with tamasic equality and tamasic recoil. I was raised Catholic, but I had a surface level understanding of religion, wasn't particularly spiritual, and was essentially living my life on autopilot. I didn't become seriously interested in spirituality until I took care of my grandparents while they were dying. In the aftermath of their deaths, I retreated from the world and the pain of nature and immersed myself in spiritual practices. So this retreat is the tamasic element, I think. I moved far outside of the city and adopted a world-denying spiritual worldview because I could not cope with the pain that their deaths had caused me. I spent my days meditating because if nothing was real, there was no need to do anything productive. However, after considerable time, I came to realize that these traumatic events were incredibly transformative and, dare I say, positive events in my life. The resentment I harbored towards my siblings and cousins for abandoning our family and leaving the task to me, meaning taking care of his grandparents, faded. I realized that things had happened the way they were always meant to happen. I had been living on autopilot for so long, and these events served as the awakening I needed. I am not sure that my siblings or cousins would have experienced the same awakening or positive effects from the trauma. And he goes on, I began to view these seemingly horrible events almost with gratitude, the recognition that Mother wills these things so we may learn and grow from them. Upon recognizing this, subsequent events such as deaths that I would have previously run from have become easier to deal with. And although I'm not fully there yet, I no longer isolate and hide from the pain of nature to the extent that I once did. The initial tamasic recoil I experienced directly led to the beginning of my spiritual life and my relationship with God. So I think that's an interesting parallel with these two different people. At some point, well, maybe they started their spiritual life dismissing the world as unreal, retreating from it, but then they gradually evolve to a more mature, maybe, attitude and more accepting attitude and trying to see the divine in all beings. More like a Vijnana Vedanta, moving away from Shankara toward Vijnana. That was certainly my own experience, my own journey. Another person says, when I read Edwin Arnold's The Song Celestial, I was struck by the beauty of the Gita. That's Edwin Arnold's old translation of the Bhagavad Gita. I could barely understand it, though. Next, I read his work on the Buddha, the Light of Asia. As a student of engineering, also battling depression and having dropped out of college, I clearly recall meditating on the Buddha and experiencing a tamasic recoil, a kind of bottoming out when I understood that I couldn't fall any lower. Therefore, I began an upward climb. I returned to college, completed engineering, and started my journey of rajas, excelling in professional life. I hit a roadblock in 2018 when I lost my job due to a layoff. My sattvic journey started with the Diksha, spiritual initiation by Swami Gautamānanda, who is now the president, in 2019. I'd say that my most recent test was in November 2024, when I was jolted out of the sattvic equality by a roommate who constantly tested me. Since then, I believe I'm making an ascent, guided by spiritual discipline. And I'll share another one. Okay. My spiritual life began mostly with Rajasic equality. Previously, I was almost exclusively interested in mathematical and scientific knowledge and threw my energy in that direction. After reading the Gita for the first time, it convinced me that mastering my self-nature and realizing the soul was a much higher ideal than empirical sciences and logical symbol pushing. At first, I tried to will my way to this higher ideal. When the most base and gross desires, the low-hanging fruit, started to slip away, I would gain motivation and the will to progress would increase. Nonetheless, the detection of subtler desires and the realization of how deeply rooted they are made me realize how daunting a task this was. Also, life circumstances would arise periodically that made the road challenging. It was all too easy to get a bit tired and lose hold of the reins for what seems like a split second, and in a snap, the mind was back to square one. And there are a lot of other lovely responses, which I can't read because we don't have too much more time, and I want to get to some of your questions. But let me read one more. My spiritual life in this body began with sattvic equality. With my career and my warrior nature, it has become more rajasic and engrossing than I expected or wanted. But my character, quote, formed by austere endurance, that's the stoicism, has remained. It is exemplified by the warrior called to fight the battle to slay desire. All desires must enter the soul, and the soul must not be impacted. At this stage, I am attempting to return to an emphasis on sattvic equality, with the added recognition that what happens to my body and my material possessions, for instance, loss of personal relationships, professional disappointments, political and environmental disasters, etc., 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 are opportunities to polish the mirror, to realize my true self, and to realize my higher spiritual nature in all beings and things. So, I wanted to address some of your questions. Karthik asks, at the start of the chapter on equality, Sri Aurobindo lists the 6 signs of the divine worker. This clarifies the point for me. Thank you, Karthik. In our last class, Karthik raised this question. He says, well, because in my study question, I referred to 5 signs of the divine worker, and he was wondering whether there isn't a 6th. And I think Karthik is right, and I think that this is pretty definitive evidence, because what he's referring to is the first sentence of the equality chapter, which is as follows. Page 188. Since knowledge, desirelessness, impersonality, equality, the inner self-existent peace and bliss, 5. 6. Freedom from, or at least superiority to, the tangled interlocking of the 3 modes of nature are the signs of the liberated soul. So Karthik is right. I was wrong. I'm happy to admit it.
And the last one, doesn't it encompass everything else, like Triguna Tita?
Are you trying to help me here, or
I'm just asking.
because that would be nice, but or a middle ground between the 2 positions, Karthik and mine, or I don't know. Yeah, I mean it's hard to but all of these are kind of like, you can't put any of them in airtight compartments in a way. They all kind of entail each other in a certain way. So I think I'm with Karthik on this. I think there are 6 signs of the divine worker. You've convinced me, Karthik. Thank you. Okay. You don't have to rub it in. I'm joking. Okay. Now, Sultan. On page 192, Sri Aurobindo explains that the soul is initially... Oh, actually, before I get into it, I wanted to read this, because I thought this is a really cool little passage, and I'm actually curious what you guys think of it. Sri Aurobindo says on page 192, the same page that he's referring to. I'll get to Sultan's question in a second. But Sri Aurobindo says, he said, in reality, the spiritual change, so spiritual transformation, is not at all more difficult than the realization of the dreams the desire soul pursues, nor entails more struggle and labor in the attainment than the tremendous effort which the desire soul expends in its passionate chase after its own transient objects of pleasure and desire. It's a really interesting comment. I mean, we think that worldly people have it easy, and spiritual aspirants are kind of depriving themselves of all the fun that these people are having, and it's just really hard. Spiritual life is really hard, and it's way harder than anything worldly. And Sri Aurobindo says it's actually, look at how much effort, how much struggle is involved in people, trying to make $1 million or get that woman or man or whatever that they're coveting, or this or that. It's interesting. What do you guys think about that? I'm actually curious. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Is spiritual life harder? Is a spiritual pursuit harder than worldly pursuits?
I think it's less work, but it's...
What is less work?
Spiritual. It's like worldly life involves a lot of work, but the results are more immediate. They're more tangible. That's
right, exactly. And in fact, there's a line in the Gita which says this basically, which is that results of worldly actions are kind of immediate, and because of that, you're like, okay, I can appreciate the result. I'm enjoying it. And whereas in spiritual life, you kind of feel like you don't even know, like there's not tangible, right? And sometimes you're even like, even though you spend your whole life talking about God and praying to God, you're like, does he even exist? I don't know.
And you're going against the grain.
You're going against the grain, yeah.
The world's going this way.
And you're walking on the razor's edge.
So as far as physical effort, it's probably less physical effort than worldly life, but it's different.
Yeah.
That probably really depends upon your development and where you actually are in your spiritual journey. In the beginning, spiritual life will probably seem to have that higher...
more effort.
Yes.
Yeah. And then later it becomes less. Baby monkey to baby kitten.
I look at it a bit differently. If you're in the world and doing worldly things, it's really hard to be spiritual. And therefore worldly life is very difficult if you're going to be involved in a spiritual path while being in the world. Sure.
Well, that's a different point. I'm not sure that's what... Yeah.
But I'm sorry, there's no dichotomy.
Right, I see, in that sense.
It's all interspersed.
Okay.
And likewise, you can be in you can do what you do, right? But be very worldly in a way. Absolutely. Or have to not necessarily be worldly, but have to deal with the world.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, these are different concepts.
Right. I see.
The two are all part.
I got you. You can't make a neat separation between worldly and spiritual.
That's a false dichotomy.
In that sense,
yeah.
Okay, but what he's saying is he's distinguishing the desire soul. So the person who desires worldly things, right, and is trying to fulfill his worldly desires. And contrasting that with the spiritual aspirant who's kind of aspiring for the divine.
I want to make $1 billion so I can give it all away. Is that desiring worldly things or spiritual things?
Do you want your name in the newspaper after giving it away?
No, I don't care.
All right, more power to you, Anthony. Give me the $1 billion then. All right.
I think when things are going your way, when you're having fun, actually the spiritual life is much harder. Like if you are, for
when
instance,
you have a lot of success in worldly life,
and your health is good, you're enjoying life, and then you have to go to, let's say, a Gita class or something like that. But when
God forbid,
your friends are having a party.
What did I drag you away from today? Anyway.
But it's much easier when things are going really bad. It's very easy to abandon.
Yeah. It's the same logic behind, in Vedanta they say these heavens that you go to temporarily because of your good karma. Those are not places for spiritual growth or progress. Why? Because things are just too hunky-dory. This earth, this is the karma bhumi. Sri Ramakrishna would use the word karma bhumi. Why? Because it's a nice balance of pleasure and pain, happiness and suffering. We need that. Otherwise we won't grow until we get kicks and blows. Swamiji used to say, suffering is the great eye opener.
But also, if you only got kicks and blows,
no, that's not going to work either. Well, that's hell. We don't want that. Yesterday. You didn't see it yet, did you? I had the honor of driving Francis Clooney, a professor at Harvard and a Catholic priest, a Jesuit, to Santa Barbara. He gave the Sunday talk there, and afterward I asked him a question. Where was it going with this? What were we just talking about?
Because
Hell, thank you. That's it. That's the word I was looking for. Okay, so I asked him this question because all his life he's been a Catholic Jesuit.
Just remember your.
I know. Yeah, I know. It's okay. I'm not criticizing it. Okay, and all his life he's also been an extraordinarily prolific and brilliant scholar of Hinduism. And so my question to him was, after a lifetime of immersion in Hindu thought and experience, have you felt the need to challenge or rethink or question or even possibly to revise certain aspects of your Catholic beliefs? And then I suggested 3 different Hindu doctrines that I particularly had in mind. 1, the Hindu doctrine of multiple incarnations, that God incarnated not just once as Christ, but also as Ramakrishna, and so on. 2nd, the Hindu doctrines of karma and rebirth. And 3rd, Hindu universalism. Does anyone know what universalism is? Everyone is going to get liberation in the end. And I also added, not all Hindus believe that, but at least our tradition, the Ramakrishna tradition, definitely does. And his answer is quite interesting. You can watch it. It's on the Santa Barbara website, and I recommend that you look at it. It's toward the end of the video. I asked the last question. And with hell, he gave a very clever response, actually. He said, Catholicism posits an eternal hell, but it doesn't say that there has to be anybody in that hell. It could be empty. It's really, I've heard this before, but
he said that's the modern position. If I got it right.
That's actually that's true. I mean, I think that actually it's a theologically respectable position now. It's like some liberal Catholic theologian. I don't think you can generalize and say it is the.
No, I'm saying that
but,
it wasn't necessarily the standard position for most of.
It was certainly not.
Right? Yeah.
No, read a portrait of the artist as a young man, James Joyce, and the Irish Catholic Jesuits would love to scare the hell out of these little kids by telling that if you don't become Catholic and be a good Catholic, you're going straight to an eternal hell. And so,
if you get only one life, then you are going to hell. But if you get to reincarnate, there is
then
no
you have
eternal
many
hell,
chances.
unless you consign yourself there, and then there is an eternal hell.
Mm-hmm.
For as long as you choose to stay there, you're there.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
It's all the same.
Well, there you go. All right. Okay.
That's Hinduism, isn't it? Or am I wrong?
All right. Well, actually, Hindu, it's tricky. I mean, look, Madhva, for instance, Dvaita Vedanta, he posits an eternal hell for some souls. And he has categories of souls, and he says some are tamoyogas, those who are destined for darkness. Oh. And so, not that they choose it, but they're somehow perversely kind of, they just can't help but do bad things, which land them in hell. But fortunately, we don't believe in an eternal hell in our tradition. Let's stick with that. Okay, Sultan. He says on page 192, the same page that we were just talking about, Sri Aurobindo explains that the soul is initially reluctant to pursuing the higher spiritual equality because this joy is less familiar and tangible than the joy of the senses or nature. That's what you're saying. The entire paragraph that contains these ideas touches heavily upon some of my main doubts in spiritual life. In my life, I've experienced a vicious cycle where the more unfamiliar this higher joy seems, the more I am attracted to grosser pleasures, and the higher joy seems even more unfamiliar. So it's that vicious cycle. Even at times when this higher joy is unfamiliar to me, and I try to trick myself into taking joy in spiritual things, it feels like the soul is just part of my imagination. As an aspirant, a practical question that I have is, how do we familiarize ourselves with higher joy when at first everything in our nature is pulling us away from it? Also, a more philosophical question that I have is, why would we be predisposed to be unfamiliar with this higher joy if it is essential to our very existence? I like these questions a lot. They're very thoughtful, and they're hard. And so can any of you help me with either of them? So as an aspirant, a practical question that I have is, how do we familiarize ourselves with higher joy when at first everything in our nature is pulling us away from it? I don't have like any great answer, but you guys can. Go ahead, Rahul.
I would venture that he's already somewhat familiar with it if he's talking about being an aspirant in the first place. Right?
Okay, so yeah, he's maybe less bad than he's making himself out to be, and more further along than he's letting on. That's one thing. Sri Aurobindo, Sri Ramakrishna distinguished 3 kinds of joy, ananda: Vishayananda, Bhajanananda, Brahmananda. Vishayananda, the joy you take in worldly things, sense objects and other things, name and fame or whatever. Bhajanananda, the joy you find in bhajan. Bhajan means worship of God and thinking of God and the spiritual practices in general, you can say. I think that what and then the third one is Brahmananda, the bliss you feel when you realize Brahman, God, right? Okay. So I think that what Sri Ramakrishna is saying is that there's a qualitative difference among these three. It's not just a difference in degree, but it's a difference in kind. And that we don't need to be, like, obviously we don't know what Brahmananda is like. We haven't realized God. But I think we can all say, as spiritual aspirants, that we have some glimpses of Bhajanananda. The joy of, we had Ramnam, a beautiful Ramnam this past weekend, and you know, you don't have to be that spiritually elevated to appreciate the atmosphere. And so and it's different, it's qualitatively different. Go to a nightclub with your friends, that's going to feel different. Get drunk in a bar, you know, that's different from the Ramnam and from...
I would say, even for atheists, right, I mean, the pleasure that you might get out of charity or being altruistic, I think can also be in the second category.
Yeah. So I don't think that's... Right, so Bhajanananda we can understand in a broader way. The joy of spiritual practice. So that includes Buddhism, Jainism, anything that even atheistic practices. But something that, you know, it's not a gratification of the ego, it's not a gratification of the body mind, it's a gratification of the soul, the deeper soul within. Right? And that's just a spiritual... That's why in the Gita chapter 18, distinguishes three kinds of sukham, happiness, joy, sattvika, rajasika, and tamasika. And rajasika is based on anything that gratifies the body-mind complex. Sattvika is Atma Buddhi Prasadajam, which means it gratifies the Atman and the higher intellect. It gratifies the soul. And that's why the structures, they're opposites. Rajasika, Sukham is like nectar in the beginning and becomes like poison in the end. All worldly pleasures like that. All forms of instant gratification are like that. Everyone knows that. And Sattvika joy has exactly the opposite structure. In the beginning, it's like poison. In the end, it becomes like nectar. And so, Sultan, I would also recommend you just stick with it. And yeah.
Also, I think it's important in that kind of situation to seek community, seek something that helps you get outside of yourself. So if you're sitting in your room meditating and you're failing to feel the higher joy, then sitting in your room doing more meditating
it's not going to help.
Probably not going to help.
Yeah, you're probably going to a downward spiral. Yeah.
Go to a bhajan, kirtan,
right.
or go do some community service or something that gets you in touch with other people.
That's a nice practical point, which is like being stuck in your own head is probably the worst thing you can do in that situation. Go out, and I think you like ISKCON, so go to your nearest ISKCON temple and start grooving, dancing with them and doing some kirtan with them. It's nice, and it helps you get out of your own head. And your next question is deep, a more philosophical question. Why would we be predisposed to be unfamiliar with this higher joy if it is essential to our very existence? I mean, the easy answer is Maya, delusion. God is within us, and yet we think God is so far away. What?
Also, like the ecstasy of having lost it and finding it again intensifies the experience of the joy.
The bliss, rediscovering the self within or God within, Okay, and let me read another question. Gita, it's long. Let me just see. Okay, what Sanskrit word or words is Sri Aurobindo translating as equality? Well, sama or samatva, I believe. And then she says, it seems to be sama something, so she's right, but doesn't matter what that something is. Could it be samatvam like in 2.48? Being even-minded, having equality is what is meant by yoga. Samatvam yoga uchyate is 2.48. Yoga is defined as samatvam, equality. Samatvam seems to also mean having equanimity or indifference, of balanced consciousness, evenness of mind, even-keeled, unperturbed sameness in all conditions, having one's mind in perfect balance. This gives one tranquility, mental peace, and a calm temperament. It is the opposite of anxiety, worry, and mental restlessness. Is that what he means by equality? I think yes, but I'm not entirely sure what your question is, but it is the case that we notice in one of our verses that we discussed today, is that samasiddhau asiddhau cha. You can be equal in success and failure. There are also ones like sama dukkha sukha. You can be equal in pleasure and pain, happiness and sorrow. There are different pairs of dualities that you can be equal toward. And you can also just define equality as equality in general, which is a kind of equanimity, being even-keeled, not affected and not reacting, not being reactive under any circumstances. And then, let's see. Isn't Trigunatita, or having the three gunas balanced, not possible while aware of the tattvas according to the Sankhya? Totally balanced gunas cancels them out and makes one in the nirguna, according to some yogic schools. I think there's a little mistake here, because Trigunatita in Sanskrit does not mean having the three gunas balanced. Atita means beyond. So going beyond the three gunas is what Trigunatita means. So it's not a balancing of the three gunas, it means going beyond them. Okay, good. Any questions? Sorry, you guys barely talked. Well, some of you did, but any last question? I'm giving you the floor here at the end. No? We're all good? Let me one more time remind you guys, for those who came a little late, our next class is going to be held on Monday, January 27th at 7:30 p.m. PST. So Monday again, not Sunday morning. Monday, January 27th, 7:30 p.m. The assignment is to read verses 36 to 42 of chapter 4 of the Gita and verses 5.1 to 5.19. So verses 1 through 19 of chapter 5 and chapter 20 of Sri Aurobindo's Essays on the Gita, entitled Equality and Knowledge, pages 200 to 211. And please answer the study questions based on that chapter by Sunday, January 26th at 7 p.m. Thank you so much. See you guys on Monday, January 27th. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Paramastu.